Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 15, Section 3. And so we're talking about politics during the Gilded Age. The term Gilded Age was coined by a famous comedian and satirist named Mark Twain, famous author of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, among many other works. He called it the Gilded Age because on the outside America looked to be prosperous, looked to be wealthy. The gross domestic product was increasing. The average standard of living was going up. However, gilded means painted over. And he called it the Gilded Age because while on the outside America looked wealthy and prosperous and shiny and exciting, but on the inside it was like a whitewashed tomb, looking good on the outside, but on the inside full of dead men's bones. On the inside, America was impoverished. Our government was corrupt. It was run by the extremely wealthy. And there were some big problems that needed to be fixed, and some that still need to be fixed. And so today's theme is corruption.
I was talking to my lawyers. They said something to me. I can't believe it. Did you really find $1 million in the trunk of a car and turn it in? Did you do that? You did that for real, huh? My man. Good for you. You know Johnny Law got it though, right?
Maybe.
Ain't no maybe about it, Mr. Richard. You know he got it. You turned that money in, he took it, and you ain't get nothing for it, did you? Why you do that?
It was the right thing to do.
Oh, that's true. That's a good answer. It was the right thing to do. The question I've been asking myself is, would you do it again? I mean, that's a lot of money. That's a long time ago. Many car payments ago, many child support payments ago. So I said to myself, the only way to find out is to find out.
Bribery, extortion, murder, racketeering.
You give me an address, I make sure the car's there, I make sure that money's in that trunk.
No thanks.
You sure? Come on now, Richie, what you think that impresses me, huh? You think that you better than them? You ain't no better than none of them other cops. In fact, you the same as them. You are them. Let me ask you this. Do you really think that putting me behind bars is gonna change anything on them streets? Them dope fiends are gonna shoot it, they're gonna steal from it, they're gonna die for it. Putting me in or out ain't gonna change one thing.
And that's the way it is.
That's just the way it is. So what we got, Richie? We got me and you sitting here. You got that little snitch-ass driver for my brother. You got a little bit of powder. You're gonna need more than that, Richie.
I got possession, supply, conspiracy, bribing a law officer. I got people who attest to seeing you kill in cold blood. I got your offshore bank accounts, your real estate, your businesses, all bought with money from heroin. And I got hundreds of parents of dead kids, addicts who OD'd on your product, and that's my story for the jury. That's how I make it all stick. This man murdered thousands of people, and he did it from a penthouse driving a Lincoln. Aside from that, you got nothing to worry about.
That's pretty good, but that's why we go to court, isn't it, Richie? Because I got witnesses too. I got celebrities, I got sports figures, I got Harlem, Richie. I took care of Harlem, so Harlem's gonna take care of me, you can believe that.
The second half of the 19th century was a boom time for American cities. Although there were some large cities in the United States by 1800, it was in the late 1800s that large, thriving industrial cities grew to dominate much of the North and some of the South. No American city exemplifies this rapid development better than New York City. In the early 1800s, New York was already the largest city in the United States. 80,000 people lived there, crammed into the southern part of the island of Manhattan. For New York City to continue to grow, city planners created a plan for the future development of Manhattan. The plan showed an imaginary grid of streets. It stretched over the rest of Manhattan, where at the time, hardly anyone lived. This grid system was a great success. It was the only thing that remained constant in this always changing city. Another development that helped New York City grow was an expanding trade and transportation network. In the 1820s, New York State built a canal system linking the city to the Great Lakes region. Later, railroads leading into the city made overland travel faster than ever. Both this canal and the railroads helped make New York a center for world trade and attracted more workers and immigrants to the city. As the city grew, its leaders realized that it lacked large public spaces. So to give the growing population a place to escape the city's crowded streets, they decided to build a huge park in the center of Manhattan, Central Park. Today the park looks as if it has been there forever. But more than 3,000 men worked more than 10 years to transform the middle of Manhattan into this calm and beautiful area. By 1870, 50,000 workers were commuting to Manhattan every day from Brooklyn across the East River. City leaders realized that the companies that ran ferry boats to move these people would soon be unable to handle the growing numbers. So they launched an ambitious engineering project, building the Brooklyn Bridge. When the bridge opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge of its day. The lattice work of cables supporting the road and walkways is an amazing piece of engineering. The Brooklyn Bridge was so well engineered that it holds the weight of 144,000 vehicles that cross it every day, even though it was not built with cars in mind, because they were not yet in use. At the same time the bridge was being built, New York was leading the way into a new technological age. An invention adopted there first would change the world: electricity. The man who sparked the electrical revolution was Thomas Edison. Edison chose an area in downtown Manhattan to become the first district wired for electricity. In just 18 months, workers built the first power station and laid nearly 80,000 feet of underground cables. At 3 p.m. on September 4, 1882, Edison flipped the master switch. The lights came on, and as darkness slowly descended, the lights got brighter. That night, the area was like a wonderland. New Yorkers saw a strong, steady light, not the flickering gaslight that people were used to. Electric streetlights allowed workers to travel to and from work more safely at all hours. Cities could now operate 24 hours a day, every day. But New York was not the only city experiencing rapid change. While New York would eventually become famous for its skyscrapers and subways, it was not the first American city to have either. Nearly 800 miles to the west, Chicago was experiencing a rebirth. In 1871, Chicago was engulfed by a devastating fire that killed hundreds of people and destroyed a large portion of the city. The people of Chicago quickly began rebuilding. This time, they used more modern materials, building techniques, and technologies. Architects in other cities across the United States were making their large buildings out of bricks, mortar, and iron. Chicago was the first city to use a steel frame to support a building. Chicago's home insurance building, built using a steel frame, was completed in 1885. Though it was only 10 stories, it was the world's first skyscraper. Steel frames allowed buildings to be built much taller than their brick counterparts and became a key principle in skyscraper engineering. Within decades of the fire, Chicago was flourishing again. Between 1870 and 1900, Chicago grew from a city of fewer than 300,000 people to one holding nearly 1.7 million. While Chicago was spearheading the architectural move to build skywards, Boston was marking a first in the opposite direction. In 1897, Boston's Tremont Street subway became the nation's first underground subway system. The new forms of transportation available in the late 1800s, such as subways, horse-drawn or electric trolleys, and elevated railroads, allowed cities to expand over larger areas and attract even more people. Many people who lived in rural areas flocked to the growing cities to find jobs in the factories there. In 1860, only 1 American in 6 lived in a city. By 1890, 1 in 3 did. Immigrants entering the country also streamed into the cities looking for work. Between 1870 and 1900, people came to the United States from Europe in record numbers. During the 1880s alone, around 5 million immigrants entered the country. The rapid growth of cities caused housing shortages. City dwellers often were forced to live in cramped, crowded, and unsafe lodgings called tenements. And city leaders had to scramble to keep up with the demand for safe water and sewage treatment. Despite these hardships, the rapid industrialization and urbanization of the late 1800s helped form the foundation for modern society.
And speaking of corruption, we first need to learn about political machines. These are organized groups within a political party that cooperate to control cities, to run them like little kingdoms. How can you do that within a democracy? I thought the point of our country is that the people control. That's what Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address. Of the people, by the people, for the people. But then if you happen to come across a political cartoon on your test, maybe you saw where it said, of the monopolist, by the monopolist, for the monopolist. And that cartoon was a critic of the time that we're talking about, where monopolies were controlling politics, where people were so wealthy they were buying elections. But how could they do that? Well, number one, these political machines could give services to voters. Sometime you need to watch a movie if you're into the mob or you're into cop shows. American Gangster is one of my favorites, starring Denzel Washington. It's a true story of a mobster in Harlem who was involved in the alcohol trade during Prohibition and got involved in the heroin trade once alcohol was legalized. He ran the ghetto of Harlem as if it was his own kingdom. And that's certainly not an isolated incident. You know, Al Capone ran Chicago, Pablo Escobar ran the country of Colombia for a time, Roger Taney ran the city of New York. But how did these men do that? Well, number one, they would buy the loyalty of voters by giving them services. They would offer financial support for businesses, making businesses and voters and people dependent on these individuals or these groups. After the Civil War, machines using these methods could gain control of major cities. These were extremely well organized. The precinct captain in charge of each local precinct would often guarantee voters by, again, ensuring they would come out, by giving them services, by making them loyal through codependency. Ward bosses, like the one you saw in Far and Away, the Tom Cruise Nicole Kidman movie, could run precincts by helping immigrants get jobs, get housing, etc. But then at the top was the city boss. And there's tons of movies about these individuals, but more importantly, they were able to bypass the democratic system through very corrupt means.
In the late 1800s, the United States experienced rapid industrial growth. Many people left rural areas or their homes in Europe to find work in the new factories in America's cities. Large corporations spread across the country. New schools and universities were established to educate the growing workforce. As people became more educated, the newspaper and publishing industries boomed. But this period of growth also included corruption and inequality. Big businesses often used their growing profits and power to destroy competitors and form monopolies in the railroad, steel, coal, and oil industries. Working conditions in mines and factories were harsh and dangerous. And as people flooded into the cities in search of work, the problems of crowded housing and poor sanitation increased. Corrupt city leaders called bosses often accepted bribes and gave contracts and jobs to their political allies. The reform movement of progressivism arose to combat the greed, corruption, and other problems that industrialization had created. Progressives, most of whom came from the middle class, wanted to improve the lives of the poor living in America's growing slums. They also condemned the abuses of corporate power and the corruption in city governments. Progressive writers wrote fictional stories and poetry that revealed the hardships faced by many people living in America's cities. Progressive journalists used biting articles and cartoons in newspapers and magazines to expose the corruption of city bosses and business leaders. These writers were called muckrakers because they dug into the dirty deeds of those they wished to expose. Progressives succeeded in creating a public outcry against government corruption. Teddy Roosevelt was America's first progressive president. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt used his position to break up many trusts. These were huge combinations of companies that used their economic power to take advantage of their competitors and workers. Roosevelt's Square Deal was designed to give all Americans, from farmers to businessmen, an equal chance to succeed. Roosevelt created the Pure Food and Drug Act to protect consumers, and he established the National Park System to conserve the environment. Progressives also hoped to win the right for women to vote. Suffragettes, or female activists, had been fighting for the vote since the 1840s. By the early 1900s, support for women's suffrage had grown as more women took jobs and became better educated. Finally, under President Woodrow Wilson, reformers convinced Congress to pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. When enough states ratified it, the amendment passed. Now women were guaranteed the right to vote. Despite these improvements, many people felt left behind. America's minority populations and new immigrants continued to face deep prejudices, segregation, and violence. While progressive activists succeeded in reducing corruption, improved worker and food safety, and increased the rights of women, widespread racial injustice and anti-immigrant sentiment remained part of American society.
Now, the political boss might be the mayor of the city, might simply be the controlling member of that particular party. As boss, they could control access to city jobs. If you were going to work in that city, you had to go through this individual. So obviously that would give them a lot of power. They would control business licenses. If you're into the Marvel superhero Netflix originals, Kingpin is a great example of a city boss. He was controlling so many aspects of the city. The courts, the police were on his payroll. Businesses had to pay protection fees. That's the type of people these bosses were. They could influence the courts to keep their people out of trouble, whether through bribes or even threats. For example, Pablo Escobar, the man who pioneered the cocaine trade into the United States in the 1980s, threatened even members of the nation's Supreme Court and had them killed when they didn't cooperate. And so they could use fear, they could use finance, but more importantly, they would control these cities. In the United States, they could control municipal agencies, public services, the police. They would arrange building projects, community services, and these bosses would receive a form of taxation. They would be paid by businesses, whether in the form of protection money or insurance, or in some cases they would even be in charge of the public funds. They would get voters' loyalty through giving gifts, and they would use these gifts to extend their influence. Now, many immigrants found themselves caught up in this process because, of course, immigrants coming off of the boat had no resources. You know, Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, when her spoons were stolen, that's all she had. That was her savings. She had stolen those from her family. She was going to try to sell those to a pawn shop to get enough money to get started here. And when those were stolen, she had nothing. And so if you watch the movie, Tom Cruise actually goes to work for one of these ward bosses. He proves that he can fight, and so the ward boss makes him a thug. And he winds up having to be part of this machine that threatens and beats up and intimidates people. Many of these bosses themselves were first or second generation immigrants, and they would help immigrants get homes, get citizenship, get jobs, and in return, these immigrants owed them loyalty. This political cartoon, in fact, one of the beauties of our country is that we do have freedom of expression. We do have freedom of the press. And there were journalists that, despite threats, despite intimidation, continued to expose these people. In fact, if you watch American Gangster, the true story of the man who ran Harlem, New York, a Washington Post reporter played by Russell Crowe would not leave him alone. And it was a reporter who exposed much of the corruption. In fact, in this case, in Roger Taney, the man who ran New York as a king, was exposed by a cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who drew many cartoons like this. Now, the machines would use electoral fraud to win elections. There was a case of this near where I grew up in Polk County, Tennessee, where the local ward boss attempted to steal the election. And this was not hearsay or corruption. No, they literally stole the voting ballot boxes, and they were going to manipulate the results. And so they would use fraud like this. They would also use graft. Graft is an illegal use of political influence for personal gain. You know, this would be if I were to use my limited influence to say, hey, if you wash my car, you know, you won't have to do your next essay. That would obviously be unethical, but I bet I could talk somebody into it. It's certainly unethical. It's definitely illegal. I could be fired for it. But I bet I could convince somebody to keep their mouth shut and go wash my car to not have to do your essay. Obviously, that's immoral. But that would certainly be an illegal use. Now, I don't have that much power, right? But imagine if I did. And imagine if I were corrupt and I were interested in getting a kickback. And there are plenty of people. You know, machines would take kickbacks, and they would accept bribes, and they would often allow illegal activities. In fact, they were often caught up in many of these illegal activities. And this corruption is widespread. I mean, think of the credit mobiler scheme, where the fake construction company was formed to overbid on projects. When that corruption was found out, Carly, the President of the United States was implicated, though he was never proven to have been involved in that scheme. But I mean, think about it. Even the president was perhaps bought off allegedly. The most famous case of corruption in the United States is William Tweed in 1868, known as Boss Tweed. He ran the city of New York. His organization was called Tammany Hall, and he led the Tweed Ring. In running the city, he defrauded the taxpayers of millions of dollars. Of course, in today's money, we're thinking billions of dollars. And he was running the city as a king for years. And yes, people, I'm sure, understood what he was doing, but no one had proof, and really no one had the power or the influence to bring him down. But this is one of those stories where sometimes it makes me want to be a journalist. You know, I just love it that there are people who are brave enough to expose bullies like this. In this case, it was a cartoonist. Old Thomas Nast brought down the Tweed Ring with a series of cartoons. And so the next clip I've got goes into a little bit about Thomas Nast, and then I've got a few examples of his cartoons to show you.
The gang's involvement in New York politics reached its height in the 1850s and 60s, when the corrupt William Boss Tweed was the leader of Tammany Hall. He used gang members to influence elections. They would grow beards in the months before an election and vote several times, shaving their beard a little more each time to alter their appearance. Tweed used his power to steal money from the city, and he gave contracts and construction jobs to those who supported him. But reform finally came. Tweed was removed from office in 1871 and jailed in 1874. As the extent of official corruption became known, people were outraged and called for reforms of all kinds. The public outrage led the city to raise Mulberry Bend, 5 Point's most notorious block. And the gangs of old New York gradually faded into history and legend. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, New York's 5 Points neighborhood became home to new waves of arriving immigrants. On the streets where the plug uglies and dead rabbits once roamed, merchants sold their wares and families raised their children. They came to New York from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from China, and from other lands around the world in search of new opportunities and a better way of life.
Now those plug uglies and rabbits in the video we're talking about were gangs. They were groups of immigrants that banded together for protection, and they represented their entire ethnic group in these particular cities. And a great movie to watch if you think this corruption is fascinating, or if really you just don't believe me and you want to see it for yourself. Gangs in New York, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Daniel Day-Lewis. Amazing film about some of these early gangs that ran their particular cities. And it does have Boss Tweed in it. I believe he was played by or represented by Daniel Day-Lewis. Anyway, here's one of Thomas Nast's cartoons. This one's called The Tammany Tiger Breaks Loose. And here you see a Roman Colosseum, the tiger representing Tammany, and he's devouring Lady Liberty. Another way these bosses would gain control is through patronage. Be careful of people who give you extravagant gifts. There's an old saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Be careful when people shower you with gifts, because they're often seeking to win influence. And that's called patronage. Patronage means that you begin to shower someone with gifts, and you win their affection through really a form of bribery. But it's not overt bribery. I'm not saying, Wesley, I'll give you an extra orange juice if you do this. Well, that's obvious bribery. Patronage is where I would say, Wesley, I got you an orange juice today. And then tomorrow, here's a donut. What's this for? Oh, no, I just wanted to give you a donut. Okay. You know, hey, Chase, I brought you, I heard you like Hershey's chocolates, so here you go. What's this for? Well, no, just, and I just do that a little bit each day. With, handful of you throughout the day. Hey, here's I heard you like Snickers, Jenny. Here you go. And then before you know it, you're just starting to come in. It's almost like Pavlov's dog. You start coming in and thinking, hey, what's he going to give me today? Oh, cool. Hey, and then one day you walk in, and I don't have anything for you. And so Seth walks in, he's expecting something, but I'm like, here, Emily, I heard you liked Three Musketeers, so here you go. But Seth didn't get anything today. And Seth begins to think, what did I do? Why didn't I get a piece of candy, but Emily did? That's patronage. You see, it's a form of manipulation. So be careful when people give you gifts, especially when it happens often. I have a friend who's a sales rep, and it's just his nature. He gives out his product. Every time we go paddling, he's like, here, guys, anybody want some free samples? And it's a form of advertising. Well, he's good at his job. All he does is, anywhere we go somewhere, he's just said, hey, I've got this whole box of samples, anybody? And people are like, oh, okay. Well, really, he's advertising his product and building his business. In this case, jobs were the patronage. Hey, Jordan, I hear that you're good at legal services. I heard you did well on the bar exam. I can hook you up. That's a big one, right? That's not a Three Musketeers. That's a career. But Jordan knows if he's going to get that legal job, he's got to come through me. And he knows that in order to keep his job, he needs to keep me happy. Again, watch The Godfather. If you don't believe me, this stuff's real, and it was going on. Civil service jobs, that means government positions in many cities in America, had gotten so corrupt that they were all patronage jobs. All. I mean, that's unfathomable that our country had become so corrupt at that point. Now, many of these appointees are not qualified. Jordan hasn't passed the bar exam. You know, maybe he will someday. But let's be honest, that's probably 5-10 years away. But again, if it's my job to give, I can give it to him. Now, that type of system is not a merit-based system. He didn't earn that job. He got hooked up because of who his dad is or etc. And of course, I'm giving that influence. I'm using that influence for my personal gain because now Jordan owes me big time. And many reformers are going to try to fix this system. Because let's be honest, if I hook up Jordan with a job in law, you're not going to want him to represent you if he hasn't passed the bar exam. If he hasn't proved the most basic competency, then you don't want him as your lawyer. But he's your lawyer because I hooked him up. And that's a corrupt system. That's not a good system. But again, that's the way some things are. And so reformers are going to try to press to create a merit-based system. It's a big slide, lots of information. In fact, I think I've got new personal record, maybe 4 presidents on one slide. And there's a reason why 4 presidents on one slide. Because some of these individuals are going to try to go up against the corruption. Most of them will fail. Some of them will be bought off. So let's run through the list. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president in 1876, and perhaps the most corrupt election in American history. That was the one where he lost to Samuel J. Tilden by the popular vote. But through a secret deal with party leaders, Reconstruction came to an end, and Rutherford B. Hayes became president. And so he's already starting out with a very bad reputation. A lot of people are saying this is so messed up. And I would agree with them. However, perhaps in an attempt to clean up his name, perhaps in an attempt to reform the government that he is now running, he named several independents to the cabinet, and he created a presidential commission to investigate corruption in the United States. In fact, this commission revealed that many top officials in our government were accepting bribes from political machines, and that our government wasn't even responsive to voters, that democracy was failing. I mean, this commission reported and said, hey, guess what? We all knew it was true, but now we have proof our government is not even a democracy. Congratulations. It's messed up. And so Hayes responded by firing 2 of these corrupt officials, hoping to make an example. And this angered many of the stalwarts within his party. The stalwarts were the kind of corrupt machine base. So the Republican Party turned away from Rutherford B. Hayes because he didn't play by the rules. And they appointed James Garfield. And Chester A. Arthur was appointed as Garfield's vice president. Meanwhile, Garfield. So Hayes was made an example of. He didn't follow the rules. He tried to end corruption, and the Republican Party turned their backs on him and did not appoint an incumbent president for re-election. I mean, that's just messed up. Why? Well, because he tried to break the corruption. So the next guy they picked, James Garfield, did the same thing as Hayes. In fact, in some cases, he was giving jobs to reformers to try to fix the system. Now, one of these jobs that he gave to a reformer, he didn't give to the man who had been promised that job. So the man who was expecting the hookup, who had done the favors, who had done the dirty work to get that job, was turned down. They killed him for it. A president of the United States was murdered, assassinated, because he didn't obey the mob. I mean, how messed up is that? This is where we are as a country in 1880. Of course, president dies, vice president takes over. Chester A. Arthur, at this point, is having to deal with a country that just lost its president because the president was trying to clean up corruption. I mean, again, like, the mob movies are often based on true stories. I'm watching Narcos right now. It's kind of dark and very violent and disturbing to watch, in fact. And it's a true story. A man ran for president in Colombia promising to end the cocaine trade and break up the mafia there. And they killed him as he was going to accept the results of the election. And his successor, when they appointed, hey, you're going to run, he was like, oh man, not me. They're going to kill me. And just in the process of running, there were several attempts on his life, including a suicide bomber on a plane. And it's just, I'm like, this is too disturbing to be true, but it is. These things do go on. So Vice President Chester A. Arthur urged Congress to pass a civil service law. And Congress finally did. It was called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This means that appointees for government jobs would have to first pass a standardized exam. Now, this doesn't fix corruption because, for example, if you've got somebody going for a government position versus someone else going for a government position, assuming they both passed the test, you can still use patronage and you can still hook up someone, assuming they both passed the test. But at least this is designed to say that they have passed some measure of competency. And even more precedents. Because again, this is not a simple fix, guys. Corruption is something we all have to address. It's something that we all have to care about, that we all have to be involved in, to stop, to expose. Well, what are these? Why are they buying governments? Why invest so much money into paying off politicians? Well, one of the goals of many of these big businesses were high tariffs. Because high tariffs would guarantee that foreign products coming in were too expensive to sell. And so the monopolists could control industries within the United States. The Democratic Party at this time was really trying to clean up much of this corruption. They were pushing for low tariffs, which would open up our country to international competition, which the Rockefellers and Carnegies could not control, and would hopefully drive down prices and fix at least some of this corruption. In 1884, the voters finally got involved and elected, for the first time since before the Civil War, a Democratic president, Grover Cleveland. And so Cleveland won. And people were cheering. They were like, finally, we've got somebody who's going to clean up this corruption, who's not embedded within the corrupt Republican Party of that time. And he won. But it's kind of like Don Quixote. He won, but he can't beat the system by himself. He wasn't able to lower these tariffs. And in fact, in the next election, his opponents, the mob, had besmirched his reputation enough that he wasn't elected. And so Benjamin Harrison became president. He supported higher tariffs. In fact, under his leadership, the McKinley Tariff Act was signed into law. Yet once again, the voters come back and say, enough is enough, this corruption has to stop. And Grover Cleveland makes one of the only comebacks in presidential history. I think he is the only president ever to have lost re-election and yet come back to win in the next one. So Cleveland was re-elected. supported a bill that lowered the McKinley tariff. He also rejected a bill that created the income tax. But the problem was, and really and I'm simplifying here because there were many goals of the mob or the stalwarts or whatever you want to call them. Tariffs was one of the common goals, however, because tariffs allowed monopolies control. And eventually it's going to go over to the Republican William McKinley again. Once again, high tariff.